Hi, everyone. I'm hoping desperately that our tech is working, and if so, hi, you should be able to hear me. If all goes well, we should be streaming to Facebook Live, to our At the Paradox Twitter account, and also on our new Free Speech and Medicine account on Rumble. So welcome to our first Free Speech and Medicine conference follow-up event. We have done one live stream event previously, but this is our first in a series of events where we are repeating some of the talks from our 2023 conference in Baddeck, Nova Scotia. We had a great conference this year with a number of very excellent speakers discussing important subjects. Many people online right now will be very familiar and concerned about our subject of tonight, which is the related issues of addiction, homelessness, and drug policy. When you walk downtown, you see people wandering around in various states of consciousness. We see tents pitched in parks. We see obituaries of young people who died of drug overdoses in our communities. And we wonder why this is happening. And tonight we have an excellent speaker to address that. Dr. Julian Somers is a distinguished professor at Simon Fraser University. He's a clinical psychologist who is specialized in addiction and addiction policy research. His body of research includes randomized trials and other large-scale studies on recovery in people who experience addictions, homelessness, and involvement with police and courts. Julian's work has become a source of conflict in current addiction policy. Some governments prioritize the goal of recovery, while more and more have decided to focus on decriminalization of drugs and provision of PSAD, public supply of addictive drugs, which is euphemistically known as safe supply. The reaction to his research in BC, where Julian is based, has included a government order to destroy over 20 years of population-level data, as well as efforts by advocates, including researchers and drug users, to have him disinvited from conferences and censured by his employer. To a psychologist, conflicts imply opportunities for reconciliation through dialogue. In the case of addiction policy, Julian has observed progress in our collective willingness to engage in conversation. He is keenly interested in discussing how concerned people can apply evidence to collectively reduce and prevent harmful addictions in our communities. I'm going to add two statistics for you to consider. Firstly, harm reduction programs and now safe supply have become our primary approach to combat addictions over about a quarter century. During that same time, drug overdose deaths have increased to a level where they now kill more than 4 times as many 20 to 39-year-olds as the second leading cause of death in that age group. The second stat is in a survey of over 16,000 clients with addictions who access services, over 60% of them got harm reduction programs such as needles or naloxone kits, but less than 1% got treatment to help end their addiction. Something feels very off, and Dr. Julian Somers is perhaps the best positioned person in Canada to help us understand where it was that we took a wrong turn. So welcome, Dr. Julian Somers. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight, and I look forward to your presentation. You probably, hopefully, if all went well with tech, you were able to hear my introduction. So feel free to correct or add anything that I missed. And with that, I'm going to bring up your slides, and I'll leave the stage to you.
Awesome. I loved your introduction. I was hoping we could end right there. That was the highlight of my day. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, anyone listening right now and also listening. I understand this will be recorded. Thank you, and I do find us, and I'm sure many of you do too, living in very interesting times when it comes to we turn our attention to drug-related problems and also the related and very interesting phenomenon of addiction. So let's see. I believe I'm able to drive here. Oh, I started with climbing to remind me to mention to you all that my own experience, perhaps like some of you, includes the problem of harmful addiction. Or what I mean, this, in my case, it's going back many years, is a feeling of a loss of control over one's drug use. And this is one of the two diametrically opposed meanings of addiction, is a feeling of being enslaved to something. And these days, our diagnostic approach has expanded from drug-related addictions to include behavioral addictions without drugs, including gambling. They look the same in terms of our ability to scan these phenomena. And for me, climbing and related activities, swimming, and the discipline of those activities played a huge role in helping me escape feeling enslaved, and to a much greater degree feeling that my chosen addictions were volitional. And if you remember nothing else, remember that is an attainable and reasonable objective for nearly everybody that we might consider that currently is experiencing the harmful form of addiction and that profound loss of agency. So, diving in. Part of what makes our times interesting, this is a framing comment, if I may, is that the discussions that I've been a part of, perhaps many of you as well, on this topic, become heated quickly and positional. So this work by Kraft, Lodge, and Tabor is part of a body of work on how we make decisions, how we process information. And within this complex figure is the clue that our affective state and how agitated, how aroused we are usually works against us in terms of the opportunity to derive new thoughts, new experiences. And this is a time to be practicing. I don't mean only during my talk, but I mean the era we live in. I think it's very important for as many of us as possible to be practicing open-mindedness, and that comes from, among other things, practicing calm. I'll start here, and now I'm diving into my subject matter with a few points drawn from the Stanford Lancet Commission's report on the North American opioid crisis. So they're explicitly including Canada, the US. They go back to the era of heroin, which I'll touch on a little bit, and then through OxyContin, and then laterally into fentanyl and other related synthetics. They point out that in their analysis of the crisis, that one of the key contributing factors was this, this is the first quote, profit motives, as well as inadequate safeguards against cross-sectoral activity, like moving from a regulatory job into an industry job or the other way, in a coordinated way. That needs to stop. The body of the report, and alluded to in the second quote, is that there's an immense wealth of practices, policies and practices that are applicable to both prevention, earlier intervention, and helping people in crisis that we're not implementing very fully at all. And lastly, they mentioned that there are a couple of policies that we ought not to follow in practice. And one of these is implementing a pharmaceutical source of drugs in the hope of displacing an illicit source. And the second is introducing the provision of drugs via vending machines. It so happens that in British Columbia, we're doing both of those things. Our main policy, at least in terms of what we hear about, is an effort to prevent people from accessing the so-called toxic supply by accessing a safer supply. And we're introducing drugs in some of our supported housing developments here and elsewhere via vending machines. It also so happens that the businesses involved in providing drugs and in providing them via vending machines have been formed by the very public health leaders that declared the current crisis and framed it as a toxic drug crisis. So our former provincial health officer, Perry Kendall, is the co-owner of a heroin company. The deputy provincial health officer, Mark Tyndall, owns a vending machine company. There are others. The former director of the BC Centre for Substance Use formed his own pharmaceutical company. There's a network and a culture. And I think that there are some questions about the appearance of conflict, but leaving that aside, if I may, there is at the very least the appearance of a culture that promotes a degree of entrepreneurialism, and as well as framing that has been present in BC, and that would probably fall into the category of the first quote from the Stanford Lancet Commission, all of which is to partially explain why no one in BC talks about the Stanford Lancet Commission except me. Here I was giving a talk. This is a common thing, and it goes back to my slide on information processing, actually. So the host of a grand rounds that I gave, and as Chris mentioned, I've been, it's died down a lot, but in the a while back, people that regarded me, I think, as threatening were actually writing to conference organizers to have me uninvited. And I know this because some of the organizers forwarded me the emails. That stopped. It's clearly a bad look, on people doing this, but it carried over beyond, the specific events into my sort of collegial world. So I'm giving these rounds, and the organizer says, I can't believe what's happening. I've never seen this before. And she sends me a couple of examples, such as the one in the bottom. And as you can see, there is this clear expression of concern from a number of colleagues, but they don't really know why. And so I go and give the rounds, and it's uneventful, and actually there's good discussion afterwards. But it's showing that there is, to me, not having gone through this before, that there is a real, or there can be, a feeling of threat that spreads way faster than I can get out in front of it. Oops, sorry. There are a couple of things about what we are doing, and I'm focusing here on BC, but BC has had an outsized influence on Canadian policies in this area. Here's an excerpt from the report petitioning the federal government for our experimental 3-year period of decriminalizing drug possession around the province. So that's the ask. The problem, we'd already published this, and we've published a lot on related topics, but this is a large, almost half of everyone who receives methadone in BC, 14,500 people. They had on average 5 criminal offenses, and of that total, 3.8% were possession. In fact, it was almost always bundled with a more serious charge, so a more serious offense. The majority of the offenses were actually more than 50% were some form of theft. If we're interested in decriminalizing, and this was done in California in some cities, we would need to decriminalize theft. But no one was talking about that. It was decriminalizing possession, leaving one to wonder, what do they hope to achieve by this? And one plausible explanation, in light of what has subsequently transpired, is that what would be achieved by this is that it would further progress the policy dialogue and practice, actually, toward legalization, which is spoken of positively in the provincial health officer's report that I quoted from on the previous slide. So it could be that. Let me jump now in as a matter of contrast, and I'm gonna time travel a little bit here. Not so much with this slide, although it takes us back 25 years. By the time Portugal was facing their massive national catastrophe involving street drug use, infectious disease transmission, crime related to drugs, and mortality, there was already enough evidence from other countries and jurisdictions for them to form a very, very robust national strategy. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I warmly commend it to you. It has a lot going for it in terms of its completeness. The key parts are, I think, to me, key conceptually are summarized here. That the goal ultimately is the social reintegration of each person currently living in some estranged way, where they also happen to be experiencing, in most cases, negative addiction or harmful addictions to drugs. The goal is not to eradicate drug use. The goal is social reintegration. And as an aside, I'll mention here that by committing to that, by committing to adequate housing, you can't have social reintegration unless you have a plan for housing every single person. That included mostly dispersed housing, and secondly, therapeutic communities, because many people need a period of adjustment, also a period of study, perhaps vocational training, but a structured environment. So it was over 50 therapeutic communities. I get these high numbers mixed up because they're now about the same as the number of OPSs we have in BC, or overdose consumption sites, drug consumption sites. So social reintegration. As a result of this, they didn't need to incorporate any drug consumption sites in Portugal. I believe the first one was introduced in 2018. I might be off by a year. It was a mobile site. And it was necessitated by the fact that their successful turnaround was so far in the rearview mirror that problems and funding had decreased massively. Problems had resurfaced, and they needed a consumption site. It was almost like a new era. And this process, by the way, of forgetting is really noticeable, especially at my age now. But it was noticeable already in the field of addiction. We go through fits and starts fairly regularly. Okay, so here I mentioned this already, but this is some of the media coverage on people in BC who occupied senior roles, who influenced our current policies, and who are themselves invested in related financial activities. So all of this backdrop from BC stands in contrast to a good deal of evidence that I'll summarize a little bit, starting here. And this is in particular the association between harmful addictions and despair. Some of you may be aware of the work of the economists Case and Deaton, giving rise to the expression "deaths of despair," also the title of one of their books. And this is noting that there are similar environmental factors related to economics and also related to expectations for the future that explain higher and lower rates of death related to alcohol, suicide, and deaths involving other drugs. So these so-called deaths of despair. Here is one of the first studies demonstrating this empirically among people who survive a poisoning episode, that outright suicidal intention or indifference to life are present in about half of the people who survive. And the likelihood of experiencing suicidal ideation goes up the more prior poisonings one has survived. So this notion of despair makes sense. There are other ways I could show that to you. But now I'm going to go back a little bit in my time travel. We're going to be decades prior from here for a couple of slides. prior to 2024. This one you may notice, or may be familiar to you, is from the large multi-year natural history study led by Lee Robbins. And this was the problem of crime and heroin use, and crime and like opioid use had fairly recently emerged prior to the time this photograph was taken. Within about 15 years, it became a major noticeable phenomenon, whereas prior to that, it was something different. And so in this large study, the servicemen, about 20,000 that were deemed that were assessed and assessed as being heroin dependent. They're called addicted in some of the write-ups. Returned home. There was a massive investment made in the growth of narcotic treatment facilities, partially anticipating their return. And what happened in a nutshell was that very few of the men who were addicted to heroin sought any form of treatment, let alone the specialized treatment from narcotic treatment centers. And the vast majority did not continue to use heroin. And there was a lot of inquiry into, like, why? How'd you do that? And was it because there wasn't heroin available? Was it because? And none of these potential explanations bore out. What it appeared at a macro level was that they had literally more meaningful things to do, and the changes took place without any medical intervention or any professional intervention in the vast majority of instances. That's true of change in addiction more generally, we've learned. But at this point in time, it was a bit of a revelation. Reinforcing this is my first mentor in the field of addiction, or his work, Bruce Alexander. Bruce led a series of studies known as the Rat Park studies. And this is a slide illustrating one of the key findings that essentially is showing that when rats are presented with an opportunity to live with other rats in a setting that is social and stimulating, they will consume far less morphine in solution than rats that are given the same chow versus morphine option, but are housed alone in cages. And a subsequent study, this is a series of subsequent studies, showed that when rats in cages habituated to morphine moved into colony environments, their morphine consumption decreased. So in a way, this is an animal analog for the natural history study that I spoke about a moment ago. Oopsie. Okay. None of this should have been seen as new. In the late 1950s, Marie Neiswander, who is one of my favorite psychiatrists really in history, but a very fascinating person. Before this, she had been treating heroin addiction, actually not really treating it, more like meeting with heroin addicts who were involved in the jazz scene in Harlem. And she actually wasn't able to make a lot of headway with them, but she then joined with Vincent Dole, who she subsequently married. This paper includes Alan Warner, and they did this really groundbreaking work on methadone. So this is JAMA, and look at that success rate, 94%. They're talking about criminal addicts. So what they mean by that are people who are generally drawn from visible minority groups, who have on average less formal education, who tend to be unemployed, in fact, who tend to be involved with crime and criminal associates, and who are heroin addicted. And they are reporting 94% success ending criminal activity. I'll show you how different that is from today. But here's what they did. oh, sorry, I've got one slide I want to show you first. Maybe I should have shown you this first. So hold that and let me go into this for a second. This is from the Senate of Canada. First census that we have of the distribution of addicts, so-called addicts in Canada. And the main thing I want to point out to you is that for most of history prior to this period, post Second World War, medical addicts, meaning those that became addicted due to a prescription initiated by somebody treating them, usually a physician or a pharmacist, or professional addicts who basically were physicians or pharmacists for the most part. Those were the high-risk groups that were tabulated. That's why we see them here. But look, the column to the left is this new so-called criminal addict group. Nearly half of the total are in BC. And I've contributed to work on national prevalence estimates of addiction, and it remains true to this day that Canada, at least, sorry, it remains true to the most recent analysis, that BC has a relatively high prevalence of substance use disorders and concurrent disorders, the highest of concurrent disorders in the country. So so it kind of emerged here. This is how Dole and Niswander went about it, and they emphasized this in their work, that they used methadone as an inducement into treatment, as an aid with withdrawal. But as you can see here, the most they could expect is that and they say merely blocks drug hunger, not miraculously blocks, merely. Then they go on and talk in an interesting way about the qualities of humans that they worked with. So the fact that the majority became productive citizens testified first to the devotion of staff. So devotion to people made the biggest difference. And they list the different groups. And their success making addicts into citizens shows that an apparently hopeless criminal addict may have ambition and intelligence. So what they're saying is that don't write people off. They have abilities and capabilities that may not be obvious, and that if given nurture, may really surprise you. And that's kind of, part of what they seem to be saying here. They were not alone in this. Sorry, I'm gonna go into this first. Standards of care. I guess. I may not be showing you the Narcotic Addiction Foundation in Vancouver. Paulus and Halliday are the authors. Did very similar work and described the same active ingredients, or in the same way as Dole and Niswander and Warner. They talked about the need for ongoing involvement with their patients, that methadone played a relatively small role, and that people were capable of rejoining families, work, separating from criminal associates, and so on. And they claimed a similarly high success rate. So these days, the same approach is reflected in some of our standards of care. So if we're talking about, if we come at it obliquely, if we come at the problem of substance use obliquely, such as through the lens of cancer prevention, you can see right here that the latest and greatest is don't drink. Like that, try that. And they add, the way one does, that a supportive environment, physical and social environment are, like obviously essential, things that are not at all obvious if you get inside the addiction field. But from this slightly one step removed perspective, you can kind of talk in a way that is well grounded, and probably without much fear of persecution. Same for concurrent substance and opioid dependence, because opioids, we talk about opioids like with a fixation, although they occupy a relative minority of substance-related problems, even now. But certainly, over recent decades, and we do so, I think, in part because we've got methadone. We have established substitutes that we don't have. It's uncommon with respect to alcohol. There's wet housing. It's not really a a step down in the same sense as methadone, though. And we don't have an analog for cocaine. We don't have an analog really for most other drugs. There's the patch for nicotine. It helps some people. Hard to think of one for pathological gambling, or when addiction is expressed in forms that don't involve drugs. And yet change is very, very common, very achievable, and tends not to, it doesn't involve drugs. So here we've got this overlapping advice in these domains to focus on psychosocial. There are a couple of psychological treatments noted here in these slides. One of the places that this is best established is among physicians, where we don't even call it addiction treatment. We call them physician health programs. They're well established because physicians and pharmacists are among the OG addict group, at least opioid addicts. And so there's this very well established model, and the results are quite clear that in that it's effective, and that what makes it effective, shout out to Dolan Neiswander, is the intensive focus on psychosocial components of people's lives, ways in which those can be strengthened and retained. Same approach is what's used if we're talking about safety sensitive workers, so airline pilots, long haul truckers. Same approach is used with lawyers and other professional groups. Same approach is used with public servants in BC and in other governments in Canada. And these are abstinence oriented or abstinence aspiring, but heavy on the psychosocial. On the other hand, if you're not one of these groups that I mentioned and you go to the public system, you will likely be offered a drug or a medication, the very thing that's de-emphasized in these other interventions, and you'll be hard-pressed to find any help with psychosocial supports. They're two worlds. To use the word stigma in the context of addiction and not pay attention to how we segregate people is a disservice to the term stigma. We illustrate stigma in how we practice. What this slide is showing is another analysis of 14,500 people, all receiving methadone, followed for 8 years on average, not the few weeks or maybe months that Dolan Neiswander, Paulus and Halliday encouraged. And during that period of time, they're committing on average close to 5 new offenses, 0.5 of an offensive island. In a related study in Ontario, by the way, for each year on methadone, each successive year on methadone, women were 7% more likely to be convicted of a crime. It's the opposite of what Dolan Neiswander established as really the what's achievable with their version of methadone maintenance. So here it's become essentially, this is a forerunner to what we've seen subsequently with so-called safer supply, or as Chris said, a public supply of addictive drugs. That people who receive methadone, if they're struggling in other ways that are obvious with their housing, unemployment, etc., they use methadone fitfully, so less than half the time empirically in our example, and about half of them are using other drugs every day. The dispensing information comes from pharmacy records, comprehensive pharmacy records. We're not missing anything. So we got here in part through the war on drugs, and this is a reference to the war on drugs. So as part of that, there was this massive expansion I mentioned earlier. Dolan Neiswander wrote in JAMA this 10-year perspective that you see, and they were doubtful that much would change. They said, "Look, you've missed the plot. It's not about the drug. It's about all the other things." But they added that we don't think there's much reason to think this is going to change, even though it's not going to work, because it's so much easier to make and dispense a pill than it is to do the stuff we did. We're still there in many places in Canada, elsewhere too. Not every place, thankfully, but we're still there. That there is this profound pessimism that people are capable of change. That there's anything really we can do. So, I would suggest to you that what we're doing in BC in this context that I'm describing, and that may characterize some of what you see where you live or work, is really a continuation of the war on drugs. A journalist who I admire, Fran Yanner, calls safe supply the war on drugs 2.0. She does that, I think, with good reason. It's a continued focus on the supply, as though that's the thing we need to change. That was the big attempt under the war on drugs. We'll intervene with the narcos, we'll burn the fields, we'll arrest people, etc. And by intervening with the supply, we'll change the well-being of our local population. Of course, it didn't work. It's not working now either. Almost everything we've learned about what makes addiction modifiable, both in terms of its incidence, its course, and its attenuation, treatment, and recovery, almost all of that is in the observable world, not the world within our skin. And yet, in BC, we're 8 years into a declared public health emergency. We have no discussion, no plan from our government at all regarding prevention or promoting recovery. Those are really the only things you can do. I'll put it this way. The only way you can have an ongoing mortality crisis, 7 souls each day, is if you continuously replace them with new people at risk. So immediately, what's your prevention strategy? Well, if all you're focusing on is the supply side, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to focus on prevention. That's on this demand side. And we have this amazing separation of focus, so that all we appear to be able to do is try our hardest at influencing the supply. And in this case, what we're going to do is try and direct people away from illicit sources of drugs to licit sources of drugs, so we know their provenance and potency and that sort of thing. It's not working. And I don't think there's any reason to think that it should work unless one's goal is legalization of drugs. Then it's a ends justify means scenario. My second mentor of two that kind of were substitutes, I was an adopted guy, and I had a few parents growing up. And by the time I got my head screwed on and into university, I loved experiencing mentorship. I was so lucky. And so I basically had parent type figures until I was almost 30. And then I became a mentor. But this is from work that Alan Marlatt really led, and I got to participate in and learn, which was on really the initial steps in harm reduction. And the reason I put this slide up is from 1993, is that it was obvious that abstinence was the point of lowest risk. And that if we were to that's one point. The second point is that harm reduction was in all the writing that everything I read and in our work, it was dynamic. It was meant to establish through this sort of miracle of a relationship the opportunity to help people improve their health in an ongoing way. And it didn't last. Oh, okay. Now I've got to go to Chris, can I go to the second part? Jump to the second part.
Hey, Julian. I don't see your second part up. I just see the one part that we already have on stage. Would you like to take a minute and try to upload that?
I will. Yes.
Okay. I will. I don't know if we have to delete
Will it
that
only
part.
take one at a time, maybe?
Yes, I'll remove that one.
Okay, I'm putting it up now. I'll continue talking because I can describe where I'm going next. So the work that Alan inspired around harm reduction included an era of a very significant focus on what's become known as motivational interviewing. But the reason these two things go together in part is that motivational interviewing as a style adopts much the same ethos as was written about with respect to harm reduction, the ethos of non-judgment, the ethos of conveying acceptance, the ethos of belief in another person, and in some ways an ability to justifiably provide hope to people. So we showed in one of our trials, early trials of a randomized trial of a motivational interviewing intervention, that very brief encounters with heavy drinking 19-year-olds could have a lasting and significant effect on their drinking over a 2-year follow-up period and related risks, compared to people randomized to bibliotherapy alone. But also of interest, the people who were the heaviest and highest risk drinkers at 19, over the 2 years of follow-up, came down somewhat in their drinking and related problems, just nowhere near as much as the people who received the intervention. So it's before nudge was a thing, but it kind of illustrated a related phenomenon that it's possible to have through an utterly non-judgmental and non-directive encounter. It's possible to have a marked effect on people's well-being. We subsequently saw that. Have you got the slides yet? Oh, my lip reading isn't that good. No, it's not coming? Oh, I need to practice lip reading. No, sorry, Chris, I can't hear you.
I'm going to try to delete the first set of slides because I don't see the new ones coming up.
Okay.
Does it say they're uploading, or what does it say?
From my computer, upload it. No, it doesn't. And we have two. Oh, okay. Yes, you'll need to remove. As a guest, I can upload up to 2, and I've already loaded 2. One from our trial yesterday.
So if I accidentally delete you, Julian, just use the same link to log in again. I'm going to try to delete the slides. I'm afraid it's going to delete you. So,
what kind of amputation is that? I thought you were a doctor.
I know. Here we go. Here, I'm trying now. Okay, and I have unfortunately briefly deleted Julian, but he'll be back with his the last batch of slides. I think he's mostly through, but there's just his wrap up to do. And there he is. Okay, so welcome back to you. And if you want to upload your
it looked like it was there. Sorry, it looked like it was.
And just I'll take this moment break as we upload.
There's still 2 there, Chris.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Oh wait, maybe I can do it. Hang on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've deleted one. Sorry.
That's okay. I got you. And you go ahead and do that. But I'll mention to folks who are listening in. Please feel free to type in any comments, or if you have questions for Julian. He's going to be finishing up after just a number more slides, and then we're happy to take questions at the end of the talk. So if you want to start putting in some questions that you have, we'll be curating them and trying to pick the best ones and maybe combine some together. So feel free to type those in now. We should be able to see them. All right, and there's your slides, and we're back in business, and I'm going to shrink into the background once again.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody. So this is the slide showing the magnitude of that reduction in problem scores over the 2-year follow-up I mentioned. This was, years, that study was done years before we could do this kind of thing, but this is a pretty, compelling way of visualizing the process of overcoming addictions. So we start with, and this, there are now a few studies to illustrate this, but this one from 2010, thanks to computers, right? There are a lot of debates that we can settle pretty well, thanks to computers and among other things, epidemiology, modern epidemiology. So if we assume that in general, people who experience addictions involving smoking, drinking, cannabis, cocaine, on average, those start in teens, teen years, young adult, perhaps. What we see here is that everyone at the origin meets criteria for dependence, and it's essentially a survival curve. So over a 10-year period, I'm waving my mouse here, there's already been a substantial elimination of dependence criteria or escape from dependence among people who were dependent on cocaine and cannabis. And I believe this finding makes the greatest sense when put in a developmental perspective, considering the life challenges. So this is a shout out to Eric Erickson. And we consider, or other developmental pioneers, that the life challenges associated with moving into early adulthood are incongruent with maintaining, for most people, maintaining dependence on either cocaine or cannabis. This is tradition for many people. This is work related, often family and pairing up related. With respect to alcohol and nicotine at the bottom, those developmental tasks, life development tasks, are not in as stark contrast with ongoing dependence, and it can last, and here we get out to 40 years before we get to a comparable level to the rate of change that we saw in cocaine over only a decade. But these changes tend to be more linked to things like a change in one's health status, an ultimatum from one's partner, law enforcement, unfortunately, in some cases, the birth of grandchildren, imminent retirement. But the main point is that change is not unusual. It is coincident with our life course, and because most of it happens without professional involvement, it raises this very tantalizing question of whether we can accelerate life developmental processes, including overcoming dependence, that appear to be occurring anyway. Can we just make them faster? Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is a bunch of, we learned a ton on how court-related and so involuntary and voluntary interventions are capable of achieving profound change today, as they did in the 60s, and as they do today with people who receive high-quality addiction treatment. We also learned in our work, this is with people who become entrenched in homelessness, which is a big part of what I've been about in the last 20 years, that what differentiates people who experience homelessness, drug addictions, and mental illness is not the homelessness or the addiction or the mental illness. Because there are lots of people in society who experience homelessness and don't get stuck there. That's the majority. Lots of people experience mental illness, including me. Lots of people experience drug addictions, also including me, and maybe some of you. So that's not what differentiates the population who becomes stuck. What differentiates them to a greater degree is they don't have people. And they have pretty consistently had a really rotten go in their upbringings. Fully 1/4, 25% of the people who are deemed hardest to house in Vancouver's downtown east side were in foster care. 25%. I don't know what fraction of 1% of the BC population was in foster care, but that is a massive difference. Pretty much everyone else, though, also has off the charts levels of adverse childhood experiences. So that's really a hidden but crucial component to understanding people who I think, most want to help and those who are most at risk. This is one of our randomized trials doing that and doing it voluntarily. So we recruited people deemed hardest to house. I'll show you a slide on their character in a second. They are characteristics. And we gave them options. This one here, agency-oriented housing, is the one that we thought across multiple sites where we did this that would be the most effective. And indeed it was. So this is basically putting people in the driver's seat. It's going back to that earlier slide I mentioned about motivational interviewing. We're right off the get-go in our relationship with our clients, we are wanting to approach them with the understanding that they are in control. How much are we in control of? That's to be determined, but they are in control. We are not presuming to tell them anything. We're giving them choices. They don't have to move into an apartment. They don't have to take anything we're offering, but they tend to. The next group was randomly assigned. And here, if you want it, here's a room in a building with 100 other people who are, and with a rich complement of supports on site, the equivalent of an assertive community treatment team in the building. And then here's usual care, which is, you know, what the government's got going on. We learned all three of these cost the same. Here's what the people looked like. About a quarter had kids under 18. When they did, they were highly motivated to reconnect at, not day one, but especially those that established stability. Most had worked at least for a year at some point in the past. 4 out of 5 wanted paid work. Suicidal ideation at the time of interview was marked. Here's where we met them, and they're concentrated in a couple of areas of downtown Vancouver, including the downtown east side. And when we offered people choices of housing, this is now a slide showing 200 people that were offered choices, that agency-oriented housing. Here's where they moved, and none of them chose a place that was in the neighborhood where we met them. None. And we couldn't predict where they moved, but we couldn't predict where any one of us would probably choose to move either. If we as a group were suddenly homeless and asked to choose where in a city we'd like to live, we would see something like this. So in the very first year, and this is from administrative data, we asked people their consent to access and link many years of administrative data from our justice ministries, the health ministry, across a variety of program areas, social assistance ministry. And so we saw large reductions in medical emergencies, large reductions in crime, and adherence to prescribed medications was over 80% as a norm among people in the agency-oriented housing, and the other conditions, it remained usually far below that level. Treatment as usual, we see signs of this, our innate hopefulness, and many aspects of this work are incredibly uplifting because of that feature, because of the persistence with which we strive to be better, even though we don't know what that means or how we will do it. But there is this feeling of being thwarted or oppressed. And in the agency-oriented housing, the first major theme was that having a stable home. So some of the professionals involved were a little crestfallen that they didn't get a shout out in terms of the qualitative work. What made the biggest difference to your, to changes in your experience? And it wasn't us. So having a stable home that's healthy, that's sort of implicit, and a preferred sense of identity. Another key factor, and this change in identity is the middle letter in CHIME, right? Those of you that know Mary Leamy's work, connection, hope, identity, meaning in life, and empowerment, so agency at the end there. But this is the one that really stood out foremost for our clients. So we've developed all this knowledge. Canadians spent $120 million so we could learn everything we did from these randomized trials. Things are simply getting worse. The government, as Chris mentioned, when I gave a version of this presentation, including this, 1 week later, we got a letter at the university, destroy the data right away. And that was that. It wasn't this non-negotiable. It didn't matter that people gave consent, didn't matter that we have standards, didn't matter that we did a randomized controlled trial that included drug results, and Health Canada says keep those data for 25 years. None of this mattered. And no one stood up for us. So don't worry, I'm not going to cry. Things are getting worse, I said, and I just wanted to substantiate that. So first we know that people who are experiencing poisonings, 2/3 of them are unemployed, and most of those have been unemployed for multiple years. In BC, over 8 years subsequent to about 2010, involuntary hospitalizations for substance use increased 2.5 times. The percentage of people who we lock up in custody, that's either for they're remanded or they're sentenced, it's about 50-50. But it's about 11,000 unique people each year, rose from 42 to 55%. This is for substance use disorders. If you throw in other mental disorders as well, it's closer to 80%. And suicidal ideation increased more in BC than other places. So we've got this, all these indicators of despair. Of particular worry is that substance use disorders, as an indicator, these are diagnosed in the civil system prior to sentencing, are the most powerful predictor of reoffending, not other mental disorders, substance use disorders. So seeing the rate of substance use disorders increasing is worrisome because one would worry it would predict this, and it does predict this. In the shadow by a couple of years of the rising rate of substance use disorders, which you don't see here, is a rise in the average number of prior convictions, which is one way of kind of thinking through not only a revolving door, but the rate at which the revolving door is spinning. The more prior offenses the whole population has, the more we're recycling people through corrections. And that's what we see here. It's close to a doubling, 3.5 to 6 average sentences, prior sentences among people in BC corrections. I think this is one of the slides that caused them to become upset. So we proposed that we should apply the learnings that we've developed. I don't mean only in BC, but around the world that are convergent, to improve and systematize how we support people in BC communities. And so this is still available on the web. It was presented to the government with a very rigorous budget and ignored. Like literally ignored. No, even thanks for participating email. We've done some other reviews. One right about 2 months before Decrim started. This publication came out. Decriminalization, and unfortunately, the empirical evidence didn't give us any reason to think that it was going to result in improvement. The main thing is that decriminalization, when paired with other robust interventions, a la Portugal, can have a profound effect. same ingredients that we used in our work with voluntary people, and also in drug treatment court and community court. We also did this review. This was a rapid review for the Ministry of Health in Alberta, and this is one that got people upset. It elicited this really irrational, very emotional response from people working in safe supply. I say irrational. I don't mean to be disparaging at all with that, but it's just really out of character, because they don't ordinarily write to conference organizers and say, don't invite this guy. But they also did something kind of unusual, which was in the open letter, which is the most public statement. They attached an 8-page critique of our review based on the checklist of AmStar 2. For those of you that know this type of work, AmStar is a rating scale for the assessment of systematic reviews. I've led a number of systematic reviews. They're a big deal. Multiple search engines. You register them in advance these days, and just they take a lot of time. A rapid review is not a systematic review, and so this is sort of the part of the irrationality. Of course, a rapid review, using AmStar for a rapid review is like rating the safety of a motorcycle with a checklist designed for cars. Insufficient number of wheels, no airbags, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it doesn't meet, but it's kind of a crazy thing to do. Even crazier, media reported it as though it was gospel. So not too many people thought highly of our review after that. But I commend it to you. I think it's a good document and is proven better with time, because a number of the things that we raised as concerns have materialized. This is key. This is recent, and it remains true today. As we go back and forth in sort of the public domain about safe supply, et cetera, the part of a companion document to the guidance documents around each drug in the safe supply formulary includes a statement like this. So say what you want about it works, it doesn't work, scream in Parliament that science says all you want. You can't get away from this. There's no evidence to support safety and effectiveness. So I'm wrapping up here, and this is again, if we didn't have to destroy these data and lived in a better world by my standards, we would be using information like this to identify where are the people, for instance, in BC, who have the same types of needs, the same profile of needs as the people who benefited from agency-intensive housing. And so people like this, they've been diagnosed with addictions and mental illnesses. They've got multiple court sentences, multiple hospital admissions, acute and psych admissions separately. They need shelter support and other income assistance in certain quantities. And where are they? And they're not evenly distributed. So these are communities that have over 100 per 100,000. There are about 2,200 adults in BC that met all of those criteria. Very few in some neighborhoods. This happens to be our current premier's riding. It wasn't in there for that reason at the time. This is where UBC is, but 330 in the downtown east side. So we would do some kind of a per capita, we would do some kind of a targeted implementation of resources. We showed that among people who were deemed hardest to house in the downtown east side, through their records, that if we go back 10 years, 85% of them were not even in metro. And that's when they were starting to experience homelessness. So they start off in communities where we know there are no resources. They migrate fruitlessly because all indicators of hospitalizations, crime, et cetera, are getting worse year over year. They wind up in the downtown east side, and there's no hope, really. So we need to, if we're talking even about fixing problems that appear concentrated in certain areas, we need to be thinking much more broadly, not just geographically, socially. These are where people are going to be able to in the short or longer term have distinct opportunities for getting better. I don't know why I have this in here, but I'm over now. I guess maybe that's why. I'm done.
That was great, and I love the last slide. That's awesome. Lovely. So just to tell the audience, Julian is an athlete, including a long distance swimmer. That's the pictures down there. So
I think this is one where I was rescued. I think I tried this swim. This is a 10 or 12 kilometer swim in Vancouver, and first 1 or 2 times I didn't make it, but I made it 3 times after.
Well, that's very honest of you. You could have told us you made it, but none of us would have known. So, well, thank you very much, Julian. Really appreciate your insights into this very difficult and certainly very timely topic. There's a few questions that I think have come up here, but I'll ask you the first one. So here in the Maritimes right now, this was really an issue that we were insulated from to some degree. It was an issue first for Vancouver, and then for Toronto, and then for Winnipeg, and then for all these big cities. But it's come east, and now, in my hometown of Sydney, Nova Scotia, this is a big problem downtown. In Moncton, it's a big problem downtown. In Halifax, it's a big problem. And the solutions so far have been to kind of push for more and more of the standard harm reduction approaches, including right now, I believe both in all the communities, Sydney, Moncton, and Halifax, and I believe other maritime communities, we're now building sort of, I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but these congregate housing facilities. The solution for the homelessness problem and the addiction problem is we're just gonna build some kind of a basic housing structure and stick all these people in it. And do you think overall, you did talk about it, so I know I'm asking you to repeat a bit of what you said, but is that a helpful or a harmful approach to give people one option to say, we're going to put you in here with everybody else with the same problem? Is that going to make things better, make things worse, or not change things?
Enough people around the world have published studies that include a response to the question, what type of housing would you prefer? That a meta-analysis has been conducted on that question. And the answer is 84%. 84% prefer independent housing. Now we have to put on our thinking caps and consider, well, what difference does personal preference make? And, from my perspective, personal preference can often be a very powerful clue. Empirically, we showed that supporting people in buildings where they all live with others who have a similar set of recent experiences resulted in the culture of the building replicating the culture of the street. People would use drugs in the corridors. Dealers would find ways to come in and out. The staff were not in favor of that, but they couldn't prevent it. And people's mental illness symptoms were worse in terms of their expressed behavior. So we had people asking us, could you find someplace else for me? These people who were overcoming their own addictions or in recovery from addiction or in recovery from other symptom clusters. And basically, they were bluntly triggered by living in this building. So I think that also there's the problem of many people having kids and settings of congregate housing especially congregate housing where drug use is common. We have new buildings for development here in Vancouver where kids can't go in, right? So, what's the long range thinking there? We're essentially forcing people to live in settings that they themselves, in many instances, wouldn't choose if given a choice, and they cost the same. Let's let me emphasize that. And where they would, in the long term, be much less likely to overcome their addictions, in part because these buildings have consumption sites built into the design, and where they would really never have a realistic hope of experiencing reconnection with their kids. So, if we're look at the demographic of people we're losing, they're disproportionately men and in their 30s. They have decades of life, and if they want, decades of work ahead of them. And many of them, in our experience, this again is the hardest to house group I keep emphasizing. And what was it, 82 or 84% say that one of their priorities is to resume paid work? So, let's listen to that, because it provides, there's also an unpaid debt here. My first job in psych was in Riverview Hospital, our large tertiary institution, in 1986. And then we were deinstitutionalizing. We did that with a commitment to implementing the slogan we used in BC was closer to home. More technically, it's community-based, recovery-oriented services. That's the phrase that Mike Kirby uses in Out of the Shadows over and over. And essentially, Out of the Shadows is a 500-page reminder to Canadians that, hey, you didn't do this thing you promised when we closed the institutions. We've got to create a system of recovery-oriented, community-based services. So I don't know, I don't know exactly why we would overlook all of that history and current evidence, and instead favor basically creating these congregate structures that fail people. But it's part of the reason I inserted, the Dolan Niswander slide and a few others, that this pitfall of selling people short seems somehow endemic to this area of providing assistance. Dolan Niswander felt the need to kind of signal that to colleagues, hey, don't miss this, right? And I think there was a need then that they felt to make that comment, and I think we need to be reminded again today.
Lovely. Yeah, the great line, the soft bigotry of low expectations, right?
That was Bush Senior, wasn't it?
Yeah, I can't remember who first said it, but it's a wonderful line.
It strikes the same chord.
It does. I'm going to bring up a couple of comments here, or a couple of questions rather. So they should display for you, Julian. The first one is from Monkey the Cat, who asked, can Julian talk about the problem of diversion, which I know I've certainly heard you mention before. And what do you have to say? So
it's a problem, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. So so the problem of diversion became a problem in part because, and I was looking at some of the public statements from 2016, 2017, just earlier today to sort of remind myself, make sure I'm not inventing history. And our government and public health leaders were saying, and so I confirmed that I was remembering things correctly, they were saying that the problem of rising poisoning deaths is from all walks of life. In fact, there was a press release today that uses that very phrase, all walks of life. And there's no statement in the latest update on risk groups. It's part of the studied omission of prevention. This relates directly to diversion, though. If your view is, if you're promoting the view that everyone is at risk, by the way, many of the leaders responsible for safe supply decrim know each other, have worked together, and where they worked was HIV/AIDS. They're infectious disease specialists, and many of the same things that they promoted then together, they're promoting now. Compassion clubs, for example, right? Buying drugs from the dark web and selling to club members. So that was true in early antiretroviral access. So safe supply, it has partly been made a problem because we've been sold the idea that everyone is at risk, but the problem is toxicity in the drug supply, almost like vectors. It's the supply that is the vector for harm. And so if we can institute this safe supply to this cross-section of humanity who are all at risk, we can interrupt this vector, right? The problem is everyone is not at risk. So we're not. How can we all be at risk if 66% of us are unemployed, who are dying? And the disproportionate numbers who are indigenous and who are experiencing obvious additional signs of mental illness, the homeless population. So, but on this other view that it's this sort of like vector analogy, safe supply starts to make sense. So it's introduced. The problem is that it's going to be targeted disproportionately to very high-risk people, not a cross-section. And these very high-risk people are partly at high risk because they are forced to live in crappy housing or no housing, have no opportunity for counseling, no opportunity for generating income of their own. They often are living under various forms of predation, like as sex workers or as sources of income. It's a really, really bad scene. You introduce so-called safe supply into that context, that's not a safe supply, that's a commodity. And people will, and so the literature on this, like even by advocates for safe supply, where they report diversion, there's widespread diversion and ongoing use of illicit drugs. It's a little bit like the argument for consumption sites. We're not trying to get people in site 100% of the time. If they're in there 10% of the time, that's a 10% reduction in risk of various kinds, right? So that's the game. And so it's out there. It's in the peer-reviewed literature. People talking in qualitative research about, well, I like help getting a job, but no one's offering me that, so I'm selling it, right? Like it's right there. And so we have this this related problem, which is the accumulation of evidence of photographs of transactions occurring outside pharmacies, pharmacy labels being gathered up by volunteers so they can present it as evidence, seizures especially of Dilaudid. And at the same time, our public health leaders are saying to this day, there's no evidence it's a big problem. Right? So this implausible denial that is just making the situation much worse and sort of like raising the temperature as it leads to a feeling of cynicism among many citizens about what's the government really doing here? What's the agenda, right? So not good.
Okay. Our next one from Clinico. Julian, do you think that there is not enough emphasis when discussing addiction on the two key pharmacologic factors, especially with opioids, tolerance and withdrawal symptoms?
Yep, I do. And people interested in this, if you haven't looked at it recently or at all, boy, this is your night. Check out Shepard Siegel's work on tolerance and its significance as it relates to poisoning. You'll never use the word overdose in the same way again. But this is actually hugely important, and we've got, so there are both acute and chronic implications that unpack from this question. The chronic ones are that in work done by Rhee and Bob Rosenheck, I think they did the first study on health-related quality of life and employment among large groups of people who were opioid dependent in the last year versus people who had opioid dependence at some point in the past, but not within the past year. And then there's a third group, which are people who never had opioid dependence. So what they showed was that people who had experienced opioid dependence in the past, not currently, were no different than people with no diagnosis, no opioid dependence history on employment. but they were significantly different on health-related quality of life. And there were basically lasting decrements to our health, which is in part a reflection of the lasting effects of tolerance, that withdrawal after a certain period of time is ought not to be expected to be a return to homeostasis as in the pre-dependent state. We're changed for good. In terms of at the acute level, one of the things the question makes me think of is the widespread practice and necessity of administering Narcan, but also the recognition that in many instances among the highest risk group, where it's administered most, that the next thing that's going to happen is the person, well, after they express their anger at you for interrupting their highs, they're going to go and find more drugs. Now you're in this bind as a helping person, because the person is very shortly going to have twice or so the dose of opioid on board plus the Narcan than they had before, and the acute effects are extremely worrisome. So all of this is to say that we ought to be thinking about using our capabilities to engage people in using less immediately. If someone requires poisoning, once is enough for a very serious and resourced discussion with them about how they could be helped to be safer, but also for the long term. The idea that ongoing, if you get your dilaudid from vending machine, you're not dealing with the street, life is good. It's like, this hideous comparison to insulin. That's crazy. It's crazy. It's not a good idea. I don't know, like, which medical schools prior to 2000 taught that it was a good idea or benign to hook people up with opioids indefinitely, right? Here we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we'll do two more questions, Julian. If you can handle that, you're being very generous with your time so far. I'll bring up another one. It's sort of a question that gives you some leeway to speculate, but Monkey the Cat says, criticizing safer supply seems almost verboten in the addiction treatment community. Why are people so emotionally, irrationally attached to this? And I certainly have experienced that myself. The people who are on board with safe supply really get angry at criticisms of it. It's not just, they really take it personally. It's almost part of their identity. You seem to be attacking when you criticize it. And I certainly know you know what that feels like. Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, so my response to this one is largely sympathetic, mostly sympathetic. I'll quibble a little bit, only to point out that I'm not sure it's the addiction treatment community that is so reactive. But I'll very quickly add that all of the constituencies of helping professionals, harm reduction, detox. Right now, I'm working on a home-based detox project service. And as I'm talking to patients, I'm thinking, why didn't we do this years ago? Because they like it a lot better than going someplace, and it's totally manageable. But from harm reduction, detox, any sort of follow-up treatment, so-called aftercare, but basically recovery-oriented supports, none of these. I'll speak for BC. None of these are at all standardized. So you can, even from the very beginning, you can consume drugs in a supervised consumption site or in what we call an overdose prevention site. They look the same, but they actually have different standards related to them. So that's true all the way along, no standards. And because of how long this has gone on, the neglect of basic standards. If you're going to do addiction treatment, you'd like to think, like any area of practice, that people are registered in some way, that they have standards that they have learned, that they're accountable. Their outcomes are measured. No, no, and no. So, you know, and of course there's this just cliche that people express an interest in getting help. There's no help available. The wait list is 6 months, right? Moment's gone, right? It's not like knee replacement where I'll still need it tomorrow, right? This is very, it's psychological. So people living in this space who are much younger than me, a lot of them are younger than me, have only seen from government complete tone deafness in terms of what's going on. And if anything, ideas about spending money that are harmful. So when people like one of the people, I know people who've done this and I consider them friends, buy drugs from the dark web, test them, distribute them to their friends. Okay. I get why they're doing that, because they've learned the hard way, watching friends die. The government doesn't have a clue. All their ideas actually make things worse. The best they get out of the way. And Safe Supply is one very modest step from that perspective that would seem to be like, how can you object to this, right? This is giving me a chance to do what I do, consume drugs with a lesser level of risk, right? So it can be interpreted as just part of that legacy of visiting harm on people. And if you're opposed to it, you're defending that whole like catastrophe. It is emotional, but I think some people come by that perspective through hard experience, and it's on those of us that would say there's a better way to differ ourselves from all those past empty promises. And that's a tall order. And, you know, it's going to take a lot for people who would like to make a difference for the better. You step into this arena and, you know, a lot of people have been before you crying wolf. Mm-hmm. So you better have your act together. And so that's how I think we need to approach this.
Okay. Our last question, just before we wrap up. I'm trying to think of a good way to phrase this to you. And perhaps it's one that gives you a chance to talk about a lot of different things, but maybe you could just pick out one aspect. So you had mentioned before, things are a lot worse in BC than the rest of the province. They still are. They have been for many years. And it seems that, you know, BC was a leader in harm reduction, right? They were the first ones into harm reduction. And yet, since the time that started in BC, we haven't seen, wow, you know, BC has made real progress vis-a-vis other provinces that didn't go into harm reduction. So I guess my question is it that there's something about BC, and it might be the harm reduction or other factors, is it something that attracts addicts and collects them from other areas? Or is BC actually creating a new supply of addicts locally? Why is BC worse than other provinces despite this real huge, let's jump in with both feet into harm reduction and safe supply?
Well, so if we look at the Senate numbers and the numbers over these many years, I believe that from the evidence that's available to us now to explain the incidence and prevalence of addiction generally, that BC is where we are because at the highest level, it's because we have very, very shallow cultural roots. There are very few of us that have been here. It's Indigenous people that have been here for multiple generations. Everyone else is pretty new. We've shared very little history. We've shared conflict, but we have very little shared history, very little that binds us. And along the way, we did nothing to repair deinstitutionalization. We're one of the few places on the planet where most of our landmass involves lands that have where there's no reconciliation with First Peoples. I mean, no treaties, right? So we have this very immature social context, social limited amount of social glue that's binding us. And we also have a culture of, as I mentioned earlier, in government that is somewhat entrepreneurial. When we add to that harm reduction, I would say, I consider myself a harm reduction person. I think there are huge opportunities to apply harm reduction. We shouldn't be known for harm reduction. Because harm reduction would apply to alcohol, like pretty foremost, because on the basis of prevalence and harm. It would apply now to cannabis. We'd have a harm reduction strategy. It should apply to all drugs. All it applies to is opioids, and in particular, injectable opioids. Why? AIDS. AIDS is responsible for a lot of what we know as harm reduction. And yeah, if you eliminate needle sharing, or if you can affect it, you will also affect transmission of infectious diseases. That's not harm reduction. I mean, it's a discrete example, but what I still understand to be a way of engaging people who are alienated and estranged, and assisting them through relationship. That's this dynamic process. That covers across whatever range of presenting problems there might be. What we have instead is something known as harm reduction that doesn't have anything dynamic about it at all. The main reason it doesn't is, well, two reasons. One is that it's not connected to anything. All of the further downstream supports that you'd need are not there, right? So you engage people to what end? Well, that's the cultural problem. People in the harm reduction space are not insisting that their role should be establishing relationships, and on the strength of that, assisting somebody to make further progress. They don't. That's not the culture. Instead, it's we keep people, and these are our people now. And it's not an escalator. It's a staircase to nowhere. People, so we get this more and more people accumulate. And sure, you get more and more people accumulating, and you say, well, we're dispensing things, or we're testing this much and so on. We're making progress. We're reducing harm. But actually, there's an argument to be made that you're creating harm as a bottleneck. So I think that harm reduction needs to be restored to something that is more like a verb than a noun.
Great line to finish on. So listen, I really appreciate you taking the time, giving up your evening to speak with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you to you for all your work and putting up with slings and arrows when you kind of veered from the accepted path. Thanks to everybody who joined us online tonight. Thanks for everybody who follows and supports us at Free Speech and Medicine at the Paradox. And we will see you soon for another great live event. So thank you, Julian Somers, and good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.